The crystal glasses never stopped clinking. Servers in white jackets moved around the dining room, carrying plates of roasted lamb that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. Somebody was laughing too loudly near the fireplace. Somebody else was explaining a yacht purchase nobody had asked about. Just another Winslow family gathering. I sat near the end of the table with a glass of water in front of me, listening more than speaking. That alone seemed to bother people. My father, Winston Winslow, sat at the head of the table beneath a custom oil portrait of himself from 15 years ago. The painting had somehow managed to make him look even more impressed with himself than he already was. Tonight was his 68th birthday. And like every birthday, it wasn't really about celebrating, it was about status. "Let's hear it again," my father said, raising his glass toward my brother-in-law. "Tell everyone the final number." Garrison Pruitt smiled like a man accepting an award he had already given himself. "The merger closed at $47.2 million, he said. 3 months ahead of schedule. Several people gasped. A cousin actually applauded. I had no idea why. Nobody at that table had seen a single page of the agreement. But confidence always sounded smarter than evidence in my family. My sister Blair practically glowed beside him. She adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist and leaned against her husband's shoulder. "I told everyone he'd pull it off." "Of course he would," my father said proudly. The praise started flowing immediately. Visionary, brilliant, exceptional, a financial genius. By the time dessert arrived, Garrison had somehow become a combination of Warren Buffett and a Marvel superhero. I focused on cutting a piece of lamb, much safer. Unfortunately, Blair noticed. She always noticed when I wasn't participating in the performance. "You've been awfully quiet tonight, Cassidy." Several heads turned. I kept chewing, just listening. That's usually what people do when they have nothing interesting to contribute. A few uncomfortable laughs escaped around the table. Blair smiled. She smelled weakness, and she enjoyed the hunt. "Come on," she continued. "You have to admit it's impressive. It is. There you go," she laughed. "That's the most enthusiasm we've gotten from you all year." I took a sip of water. Across the table, my father was already watching me, waiting, judging. He'd spent most of my adult life trying to figure out what had gone wrong with me. Blair had married money. Garrison was supposedly building an empire. Meanwhile, I drove a 6-year-old sedan and lived in a modest townhouse that didn't have a gate, a wine cellar, or a private dock. In the Winslow family, that qualified as failure. Blair wasn't finished. "You know what I admire most about Garrison?" she asked loudly. Nobody answered. She didn't care. "He finishes what he starts." There it was, the setup. I saw it coming before the words even arrived. My father shifted slightly in his chair. Garrison smirked into his wine. Blair looked directly at me. "At least Garrison's finishes what he starts." Cassidy couldn't even make it past week 3 of basic training. Silence. Instant silence. Forks stopped moving. Conversations died. Even the servers seemed frozen. The old story had returned. My favorite family myth. 15 years earlier, I had vanished from military training almost overnight. No graduation photos, no explanation, no reunion stories, nothing. The official version available to my family was simple. Cassidy quit. Cassidy failed. Cassidy couldn't handle it. That story had survived for over a decade because I never corrected it. Not publicly, not privately, not once. The truth belonged somewhere else. And the truth came with paperwork that carried prison sentences attached to it. Blair leaned back confidently. She expected me to react, maybe defend myself, maybe leave, maybe cry. She was hoping for something dramatic. Instead, I picked up my glass, took a slow sip of water, set it back down. Then I looked directly at her. I didn't fail Blair. The room remained perfectly still. Her smile twitched. I continued calmly. I disappeared because I was recruited for Black Ops. Nobody moved, for about 2 seconds. Then Blair exploded into laughter. Not nervous laughter, not uncertain laughter, the kind of laughter people use when they think they've just caught someone lying. "Oh my God." She slapped the table. "That's the best thing you've ever said." A few relatives joined in. Garrison nearly choked on his drink. My father closed his eyes and shook his head. The disappointment on his face looked rehearsed from years of practice. "Enough," he muttered. Blair wiped tears from her eyes. "Black Ops?" She laughed again. "You?" "That's right." "Oh, this is fantastic. Glad you enjoyed it." The sarcasm flew right past her. My father pointed toward me. "This is exactly what happens when someone spends too much time making excuses." I didn't answer. There wasn't much point. People only hear what they're prepared to hear. And my family had already written my character years ago. The failure, the quitter, the weird daughter who never explained where she worked, the quiet sister who never competed, the disappointment. Meanwhile, Blair was still smiling, victorious, certain. The funny thing was that if I had brought classified reports, security clearances, deployment records, and signed affidavits into that dining room, they still wouldn't have believed me. Not because the evidence was weak, because their opinions were stronger. The conversation eventually moved on. Money, investments, vacation properties, the usual. But something else caught my attention. Garrison's phone vibrated once, twice, 3 times. His smile disappeared for half a second, just enough. Then he stood. "Excuse me," nobody noticed except me. I watched him leave through the side door toward the driveway. A few minutes later, curiosity pulled my eyes toward the window. Outside, hidden near a row of hedges, Garrison stood with his back turned. His voice looked tense. His shoulders looked tight. One hand kept rubbing the back of his neck. Whatever conversation he was having, it wasn't about celebrating a $47 million merger. It looked more like damage control. And for the first time all evening, something genuinely interesting happened. Because successful people don't usually look terrified at their own victory party. Have you ever watched someone spend years judging a person, only to discover they never knew that person at all? Comment below. And if you enjoy stories about hidden strength, family betrayal, and hard-earned dignity, make sure you're part of our community. New stories premiere every day at 8:30 a.m. ET and 1:30 p.m. ET. Join us for the next one. I stayed seated long enough to avoid creating a scene. That was a skill nobody in my family ever appreciated. People think restraint is weakness when they've never had to practice it. Blair returned to soaking up attention. Garrison recovered his smile. My father launched into another story about a business deal from the late 90s that somehow became more profitable every time he told it. The dinner continued. I checked my watch, 8:43 p.m. Then I quietly stood, wished my father a happy birthday, and headed for the door. Nobody stopped me. Nobody ever did. The cold evening air felt cleaner than the dining room. I walked past the fountain near the circular driveway and pulled my keys from my pocket. My sedan sat exactly where I'd parked it. 6 years old. One small dent near the rear bumper, 83,000 miles. According to Blair, that vehicle was evidence of personal failure. According to me, it was fully paid for. I preferred my version. As I approached the driver's side door, the laughter from inside the house became muffled. The silence outside gave my mind room to wander. That was dangerous. Because when my mind wandered, it usually traveled backward. 15 years backward. Back to a place nobody at that dinner table understood. The truth was surprisingly boring compared to Blair's imagination. There was no dramatic dropout, no emotional breakdown, no tearful surrender. I was 3 weeks into military training when 2 officers pulled me out after a battery of aptitude assessments. At first, I assumed I had done something wrong. Most recruits would have. Instead, they escorted me into a small office without windows. A civilian woman waited inside. She slid a folder across the desk. Inside were pages of analytical evaluations, pattern recognition, threat prediction, data synthesis, behavioral assessment. I didn't understand most of it. She did. Apparently my scores weren't merely good, they were unusual. A few weeks later, basic training disappeared from my future. So did every plan I'd originally made. My family believed I failed. The government preferred it that way. The less attention I attracted, the better. One signature led to another, then another, then another. Eventually I entered a world that officially didn't exist. A world where people rarely introduced themselves using real names. A world where information mattered more than rank. A world where one overlooked detail could destroy years of work. The irony was almost funny. My family spent 15 years believing I lacked discipline. Meanwhile, I spent those same 15 years helping track people who moved millions of dollars through shell corporations, encrypted networks, and international fronts. Some missions lasted weeks, others lasted years. Most couldn't be discussed. None could be explained over holiday dinners. The sacrifices were less exciting than movies make them look. There were birthdays I missed, relationships that quietly died, friendships that faded because I kept disappearing without warning, phones I carried for only a few days before destroying them, apartments rented under temporary identities, flights booked with less than 6 hours' notice. People imagine secret work is glamorous. Most of the time it's paperwork, patience, and isolation. And silence. A lot of silence, especially when you come home. My father used to ask where I'd been. I couldn't tell him. Blair used to ask why I vanished for months. I couldn't tell her. People noticed the exhaustion. The distance. The 1,000-yard stare after operations that lasted too long. They created their own explanation. Cassidy failed. Cassidy never recovered. Cassidy couldn't figure life out. The story was simple. People love simple stories. The truth was always messier. A sudden voice snapped me back into the present. No, that's not what we agreed. I froze. Not visibly, professionally. The voice belonged to Garrison. He wasn't inside the house anymore. He stood near a row of hedges about 40 feet away, half hidden in the shadows. His back faced me. One hand held a phone tightly against his ear. The other kept adjusting his collar. Interesting. Very interesting. I stayed where I was, not hiding, not spying, just observing. A habit that had paid my mortgage for years. His voice remained low, sharp, controlled, but not calm. There isn't enough time. A pause, then another. No. Listen to me. Another pause, his shoulders tightened. Even from a distance, I could see tension spreading through his posture. Fear leaves fingerprints, not physical fingerprints, behavioral ones. People touch their faces, adjust their clothing, scan exits, repeat themselves. Garrison was checking every box. A man celebrating a $47 million merger should have been inside enjoying compliments. Instead, he looked like someone discussing a bomb with a countdown timer. I glanced toward the house. Nobody seemed aware he was missing. Then I looked back. He had started pacing, slowly, carefully, like someone trying not to panic. The call continued for another minute, maybe two. Then he stopped moving entirely. I couldn't hear the response from the other side. I didn't need to. Whatever he heard drained the remaining color from his face. For a brief moment, Garrison looked nothing like the confident financial superstar my family worshipped. He looked cornered. The call ended. He stood motionless. Then he checked over both shoulders before sliding the phone back into his pocket. That caught my attention more than anything else. People with nothing to hide don't usually check their surroundings like that. My instincts began connecting dots before I consciously realized it. Not conclusions, just observations. The distinction matters. Good analysts don't start with answers. They start with anomalies. And Garrison Pruitt had just become one. I unlocked my car, opened the driver's door, then paused. Because after 15 years of doing this kind of work, I had learned one simple rule. When successful people become terrified for no obvious reason, the reason usually exists. You just haven't found it yet. The image of Garrison checking over his shoulder stayed with me longer than I expected. Not because it proved anything, because it didn't. Real investigations rarely begin with certainty. They begin with irritation. A detail that doesn't fit, a sentence that lands wrong, a reaction that feels slightly off. 3 weeks passed. Work consumed most of my attention. A 12-hour day became 14, 14 became 16. By the time I returned home most evenings, my mailbox contained advertisements, utility bills, and exactly 0 signs that my family suddenly developed emotional maturity. Then my father called. That alone was unusual. Winston Winslow didn't call people. He summoned them. Cassidy, hi Dad, family meeting Sunday, 2 o'clock. No explanation, no invitation, just instructions. Then he hung up. Classics Winston. Sunday arrived right on schedule. I drove to the Winslow estate, the same property that had been in our family for nearly 90 years. The main house sat on 47 acres outside Hartford. White columns, stone walkways, enough landscaping to require a full-time staff. The place had survived recessions, market crashes, and 3 generations of stubborn Winslows. My grandfather built most of it himself. My father never let anyone forget that. Inside, everyone was already gathered in the library. Blair sat beside Garrison on a leather sofa. My father occupied his usual chair near the fireplace. Several attorneys were present. That immediately caught my attention. Lawyers rarely attend casual conversations. I sat down. Nobody offered coffee. Another clue. This wasn't a discussion. It was a presentation. One of the attorneys opened a leather folder. My father folded his hands. Then he smiled. The smile people use when they've already made a decision. I've spent months thinking about the future of this family. Nobody responded. I've decided it's time to protect the Winslow legacy. There it was. Whenever my father used the phrase legacy, somebody was about to lose an argument. The attorney distributed packets. I opened mine, dozens of pages, trust amendments, Asset transfer agreements, corporate structures, estate documents. Interesting. Very interesting. My father continued. The estate, investments, and associated holdings will be transferred into a professionally managed vehicle under Garrison's supervision. Blair beamed. Garrison lowered his eyes modestly. The performance deserved an award. He has the experience to grow these assets properly, my father added. I turned another page. The total value appeared near the bottom. The combined holdings exceeded $28 million. Not counting the land itself. A cousin whistled softly. Blair smiled wider. Then my father looked directly at me. Certain family members are less equipped to manage significant wealth. There it was. The real reason for the meeting. The room suddenly felt smaller. Given your history of instability and poor financial decisions, Cassidy, your direct participation will be limited. I almost laughed. Poor financial decisions. I was the only person in that room driving a paid-off vehicle. The only person without luxury debt. The only person who actually read contracts before signing them. But facts rarely survive contact with family mythology. I see, I said. Blair leaned forward. You should be relieved, honestly. Relieved? Managing money can be stressful. The irony nearly broke me. I took another look at the paperwork. Not because I cared about being excluded. The money wasn't the issue. The documents were. Something bothered me, a tiny detail, buried halfway through the transfer structure. My eyes stopped moving. Then moved backward. I interested the paragraph again. Very interesting. The routing institution listed for one holding company wasn't domestic. Neither was the next one, or the one after that. I continued reading. Layered entities, multiple jurisdictions, several holding companies, foreign registrations. The structure wasn't impossible. It wasn't even necessarily illegal. But it was unusually complicated for what was supposedly a straightforward family trust. I flipped to another section, then another. The same names appeared repeatedly. Not company names, corporate shells, the kind designed to conceal ownership. Now I was paying attention, a lot of attention. Gareth's smile tightened. Everything okay? I looked up. Just reading. Most people don't bother. I'm not most people. A few relatives exchanged glances. My father sighed dramatically. Must we do this? Do what? Pretend you're an expert. There was the familiar script. I ignored it. Instead, I kept reading. One routing number connected to a financial institution located offshore. Another transfer pathway led through a secondary holding company registered outside the United States. Nothing illegal on its face, but unusual, very unusual, especially when repeated. Analysts learn to respect patterns. Patterns tell stories. This one was beginning to whisper. Blair rolled her eyes. Oh, please. Nobody answered. She continued anyway. You read a few pages and suddenly you're a financial investigator? I remained focused on the contract. That irritated her more. People like Blair need participation. They need resistance. Silence makes them work harder. You couldn't finish military training, she said. Maybe stop pretending you understand high finance. The room laughed politely. Not because it was funny, because they knew who was supposed to win. I reached into my pocket, unlocked my phone, scrolled casually, then angled the document slightly. Click, one photo, click, second page, click. Third page, no flash, no attention, just evidence. Years of habit. Blair noticed too late. What are you doing? I slipped the phone away, taking notes. You don't need notes. Maybe. My father leaned back, clearly annoyed. If you're finished, we'd like to proceed. I closed the packet, stood, picked up my coat. Nobody asked me to stay. That was fine. As I walked toward the door, Blair called after me. Try not to embarrass yourself researching things you don't understand. I smiled. Not because she was right. Because she had no idea how wrong she was. Outside, I got into my car and sat quietly for a moment. The photographs remained open on my screen, the routing numbers, the shell structures, the offshore entities, tiny pieces. Nothing more, but tiny pieces have started very large investigations before. I zoomed in on one page, then another. The camera shutter echoed softly from my phone, a familiar sound, one I'd heard thousands of times. And a few hours later, that sound gave way to something even more familiar. The steady hum of secured server racks inside a federal facility where people like me turned small anomalies into very big problems. The photographs were already open on my monitor before the coffee finished brewing. The federal facility looked exactly the way most people imagine it wouldn't. No dramatic command center, no giant screens tracking missiles, no agents sprinting through hallways. Just secured doors, controlled access points, fluorescent lighting, and a lot of people staring at data. Real intelligence work is usually less exciting than television, and far more dangerous. I sat down at my workstation and reviewed the images again. 3 photographs, 9 pages, several routing numbers, a handful of shell entities, nothing dramatic yet. The trick wasn't finding answers. The trick was knowing where to look next. I opened a secure financial database available through my clearance level. Then another, then a third. The names from Garrison's paperwork began appearing across multiple systems. Interesting. One holding company connected to another. That company connected to a trust. The trust connected to a private investment vehicle. The investment vehicle connected to yet another offshore registration. Layer after layer. Like someone had spent years trying to make ownership impossible to follow. Which usually meant ownership was exactly what they didn't want people finding. 3 hours disappeared. Then 4. The office around me gradually emptied. People went home, I stayed. The further I dug, the worse things became. A company called Meridian Strategic Holdings appeared repeatedly, then disappeared, then reappeared under a slightly different registration. Another entity surfaced in the Cayman Islands, another in Cyprus, another in Malta, all connected, all moving money, none producing anything, no products, no services, no meaningful operations. Money simply entered, then moved again, then vanished. That wasn't proof of criminal activity, but it certainly wasn't normal investing either. I leaned back in my chair. Something felt familiar, not the names, the structure. I'd seen versions of it before. Not in family disputes, in active investigations. I pulled up another database, then another. The answer arrived 6 minutes later, and suddenly my stomach felt a little heavier. Because Garrison wasn't building an investment empire, he was standing inside an ongoing federal investigation. The reference number appeared near the bottom of a restricted report. Multiple agencies involved, multi-year financial inquiry, cross-border money movement, potential laundering activity, several unnamed subjects, one identified entity, Meridian Strategic Holdings. The same company from the Winslow documents. I stared at the screen, then read it again, slowly, carefully, no mistakes, no misunderstandings, no ambiguity. The company handling my family's future was already attracting federal attention. The room suddenly felt much quieter. I checked the time, 11:18 p.m. Most people would have gone home. Most people weren't trying to stop their father from accidentally handing $28 million to a potential criminal enterprise. I continued reading. The next report hit harder. The investment fund itself wasn't generating legitimate returns. The numbers looked impressive on paper. Investors received statements, quarterly reports, growth projections. Everything appeared healthy, except the money wasn't coming from investments. New deposits were funding old payouts. Old payouts created confidence. Confidence attracted new investors. A cycle. An ugly one. Ponzi schemes rarely collapse because someone discovers them. They collapse because mathematics eventually gets tired of pretending. I rubbed my eyes, then opened another report, and another. The picture became clearer. Garrison wasn't simply managing a questionable fund. He was operating near people who laundered money for overseas criminal syndicates. Millions of dollars, possibly more. No convictions yet, no public charges. But the investigation was real. Very real. Then I reached the detail that truly mattered. Asset forfeiture. My attention sharpened immediately. Federal forfeiture laws aren't complicated. If criminal proceeds become mixed with legitimate assets under certain circumstances, those assets can be seized. Houses, accounts, investments, properties, anything tied closely enough to the activity. I opened the Winslow transfer documents again. My father's estate, the land, the trust, the accounts, the family assets, everything. If he completed that transfer and those funds became entangled with Garrison's operation, the government could seize all of it. Every acre, every dollar. Everything Winston Winslow spent 40 years building. Gone. Not because he committed a crime, because he trusted the wrong person. I stared at the screen for several seconds. Maybe longer. The irony was brutal. My father believed he was protecting the family legacy. In reality, he was walking toward financial ruin carrying the keys himself. The worst part wasn't the money. It was knowing how preventable this was. A quiet knock interrupted my thoughts. I looked up. Director Corbin Locke stood in the doorway. Late 50s, calm expression. The kind of man who could make a room nervous simply by entering it. Still here? Looks that way. He stepped inside. His eyes moved toward my monitor. Not intrusive, just observant. What did you find? I turned the screen slightly. He studied the documents, the reports, the connections. His expression never changed. That was one of his more unsettling qualities. After nearly a minute, he nodded. Family? That's never simple. No. He pulled a chair closer. I assume they're unaware. My father thinks he's creating a dynasty. Locke almost smiled. Almost. Instead, he may be donating his life savings to a federal evidence locker. That earned a brief laugh. Not because it was funny, because it was accurate. We sat in silence for a moment. Then he folded his arms. What are you going to do? The question lingered. Because the answer wasn't professional. It was personal. I could walk away. The transfer wasn't complete yet. The consequences weren't mine. My father had ignored me for years. Blair mocked me every chance she got. Garrison clearly thought I was irrelevant. Nobody had asked for my help. Nobody wanted my help. Yet I already knew what I would do. Because intelligence work teaches you something important. Just because people refuse to see danger doesn't mean the danger disappears. I looked back at the reports, then at the transfer documents, then at the name Winston Winslow printed near the signature line. My father had spent most of his life misunderstanding me, but he was still my father, and whether he deserved the warning or not, he was going to get one. Because if I did nothing, the next signature he placed on paper might destroy everything he had spent decades trying to protect. I scheduled the meeting for a Tuesday afternoon because I knew Blair wouldn't be there. That wasn't an accident. If I wanted even the smallest chance of reaching my father, I needed to remove the audience. Pride performs best when people are watching. I arrived at the estate carrying a plain manila folder. No classified documents, no protected intelligence, no material that would get anyone arrested for seeing it. Everything inside had been properly redacted. Names removed, case numbers removed, sensitive sources removed. Just enough information to show a pattern. Just enough information to make a reasonable person stop and ask questions. A reasonable person, that was the key variable. Winston's housekeeper showed me to his study. The room looked exactly the same as it had 20 years ago. Dark oak shelves, leather furniture, family photographs, awards, plaques, evidence of a successful life arranged carefully on every wall. My father sat behind his desk reviewing paperwork. He didn't stand, he didn't smile, he barely looked up. You wanted to talk. I did. Make it quick. Not exactly a warm reunion. I sat across from him and placed the folder on the desk. I need you to delay the transfer. His eyes narrowed immediately. Not this again. Please look at the documents first. I'm not interested. You haven't seen them. I don't need to. That was my father. A man capable of reaching conclusions before the evidence arrived. I opened the folder. Several pages slid onto the desk. Corporate registrations, transfer structures, publicly available ownership records. Highlighted sections, simple, clear, direct. I pushed them toward him. Garrison's fund isn't what he claims it is. My father leaned back. Annoyance replaced curiosity. Not a great sign. According to who? According to the records. You mean according to you? The records don't care what I think. He didn't even glance at the papers. Not once. I pointed toward one highlighted section. This company routes through multiple offshore entities. No reaction. This one has no meaningful operational history. Nothing. This structure doesn't make financial sense unless someone is hiding ownership. Silence. 3 facts. 1 conclusion. No response. Then my father sighed heavily. The way someone sighs when trapped in a conversation they consider beneath them. You're jealous. I stared at him. Of all the responses available, that wasn't one I'd expected. Excuse me? You're jealous of your sister. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was ridiculous. My father wasn't finished. Blair built a successful life. That's what you think this is about? Of course it is. He finally looked at me. And for a brief moment, I realized he wasn't seeing me at all. He was looking at a story he'd been telling himself for 15 years. A story where every piece fit neatly into place. Successful daughter, failed daughter, winner, quitter. The facts no longer mattered. The roles mattered. You can't stand seeing her happy. I leaned forward. Dad, I'm trying to protect you. No. His voice hardened. You're trying to destroy her marriage. I pushed the documents closer. Look at the papers. No. Just read 1 page. No. 1 word. Repeated. Like a wall. I felt frustration building. Not anger. Something heavier. Because there was no argument happening. Arguments require 2 participants. I was speaking. My father was defending a fantasy. The gap between those two things felt impossible to cross. Dad. I rarely use that tone. The one from childhood. The one asking for trust. For once. Just once. Please. His expression didn't soften. Not even slightly. I know what you're doing. No, you don't. You're trying to make Garrison look dishonest because you can't accept your sister's success. The sentence landed harder than it should have. Not because it was cruel. Because he believed it. Completely. Absolutely. After everything. After all these years. That was still the version of me he carried in his head. I looked around the study, the photographs, the awards, the family portraits. My picture appeared in exactly 2 frames. Blair appeared in 9. That probably explained more than either of us wanted to admit. I stood slowly. The conversation was dying. Maybe it hadn't dead before I arrived. My father folded his hands. Then came the sentence I would remember long after the others faded. I raised a winner and a quitter. The room became very quiet. Stop trying to drag your sister down to your level. There it was, the final verdict. 15 years of assumptions condensed into one sentence. I could have defended myself. Explained everything. Told him where I'd spent those missing years. Shown him the reality he refused to imagine. But classified work doesn't become less classified because someone hurts your feelings. So I said nothing. My father pointed toward the door. The gesture was small, the meaning wasn't. We're done here. I collected the folder. Most of the documents remained untouched, exactly where I'd placed them. Never read, never considered, never given a chance. As I reached the doorway, I turned back one last time. Not to argue, not to win, just to look. Because part of me still hoped he'd stop me, ask a question, open the folder, anything. Instead, he picked up another stack of papers and ignored my existence. The decision was made. I walked out. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind me. The sound echoed through the hallway. Final. A door closing on reason, a door closing on warnings, a door closing on grace. I stood there for several seconds before heading toward the exit. Outside, the afternoon sun felt strangely distant. My father was about to hand his life's work to a man standing in the path of a federal investigation. And he had just rejected the last private warning I was willing to give. That realization changed something. Not my concern, not my loyalty, those remained. But my strategy changed, because some people cannot be saved quietly. Some truths are too large for whispers. And a few days later, the sound of that oak door would be replaced by something very different. The sharp clink of champagne glasses inside a crowded ballroom where Garrison planned to celebrate his greatest triumph. The same ballroom where his entire world was about to come apart. The ballroom glittered with the kind of money that wanted everyone to know it existed. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead. Servers moved through the crowd carrying trays of champagne. A jazz quartet played near the stage. Every conversation sounded expensive. The event was officially a charity gala hosted by Garrison's investment firm. Unofficially, it was a coronation. Blair had spent weeks preparing for it, that much was obvious. Her photograph appeared on banners throughout the venue. Her name appeared in the event program. Her smile appeared everywhere. If confidence could be trademarked, Blair would have owned it. I arrived 10 minutes before the scheduled presentation. Simple black dress. Minimal jewelry. Nothing remarkable. Exactly the way I preferred it. The ballroom occupied the top floor of the Sterling Crest Hotel, a luxury property overlooking the riverfront district. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the room. The city lights reflected across polished marble floors. A perfect place for people who enjoyed being admired. I checked my watch, 7:52 p.m. Then I scanned the room, habit, not anxiety, entrances, exits, security positions, crowd density, nothing unusual. At least not yet. Near the center of the ballroom, Winston stood with several local business leaders. He looked proud, relaxed, certain. That bothered me more than I expected. Because despite everything, part of me still wanted him to be wrong about me for a different reason. I wanted him to be safe. Unfortunately, safety wasn't on tonight's schedule. A voice interrupted my thoughts. Cassidy. I turned. Blair, of course. She approached with the confidence of someone who believed the night belonged entirely to her. A microphone rested casually in her hand. That wasn't a good sign. Neither was her smile. Glad you came. You invited me. Out of courtesy. There it is. She laughed. Not because I was funny, because she assumed she was winning. You know, I almost didn't send the invitation. I'll try not to take that personally. Oh, don't worry. Nobody expects you to. 3 medium-length attacks. 1 short jab. Classic Blair. She looked toward the stage. The presentation would begin soon. Several reporters had gathered near the front rows. Photographers moved between tables. Business associates filled the ballroom. The audience she always wanted. Then she lowered her voice slightly. Tonight matters. It seems that way. You should be happy for us. I nodded. I am. That answer actually confused her. For a second. Then she recovered. You don't sound happy. You don't sound charitable. A nearby guest nearly laughed into his drink. Blair ignored him. She stepped closer. Do you know what's happening tonight? The gala? The announcement. I already knew. The final transfer. The public celebration. The official integration of Winston's holdings into Garrison's financial structure. The moment my father would unknowingly step closer to disaster. Blair looked almost emotional discussing it. Almost. This is history for our family. That part was true. Just not in the way she imagined. The music faded. A spotlight illuminated the stage. Several guests began moving toward their seats. The program was starting. Blair's excitement became impossible to hide. She glanced toward Garrison. He stood near the podium, shaking hands and accepting congratulations. The man looked completely recovered from the panic I'd seen weeks earlier. Or at least he wanted everyone to believe that. People applauded as he took the stage. The speech started exactly as expected. Charity, growth, opportunity, community investment, future prosperity. Corporate speeches are basically fortune cookies with better tailoring. The audience loved it, naturally. Most of them were hearing what they wanted to hear. After 15 minutes, Garrison transitioned toward the real purpose of the evening: the merger, the family announcement, the legacy speech. I noticed Winston smiling proudly from the front table. Blair looked ready to burst from happiness. Then came the moment she had clearly planned in advance. Before we continue, Garrison announced, there's someone we'd like to recognize. I already knew where this was going. Several people turned toward me, of course. Blair stepped onto the stage carrying the microphone. Her eyes found mine immediately. Predators do that. They lock onto targets. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, my sister Cassidy is here tonight. Polite applause followed. I remained seated. Blair continued. Family support means everything. Wouldn't you agree? The audience nodded. She smiled. Then she delivered the trap. Cassidy, why don't you come up here and say a few words about Garrison's incredible achievements? There it was. Not a request. A public test. A demand. The entire room turned toward me, waiting, watching, expecting. I stood slowly. Not because I intended to give a speech, because remaining seated would only prolong the performance. The crowd parted as I approached the stage. Blair extended the microphone toward me. Her expression practically glowed. She wanted submission. Public submission. One final confirmation that she occupied the top of the family hierarchy. I looked at the microphone, then at her, then back at the microphone. No. The word landed softly, but the silence afterward landed much harder. Blair blinked. What? No. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. She forced a laugh. Come on. I'm good. The smile started slipping. Not much, just enough. Then Garrison appeared. His timing was excellent, almost practiced. He stepped down from the stage and moved closer. Too close. The smile remained on his face for the audience. The threat arrived only for me. Take the microphone. No, his jaw tightened. Don't embarrass yourself. I'm not the one doing that. The smile disappeared completely. For the first time all evening, the real Garrison surfaced. Not the polished investor, not the charming executive. The desperate man hiding underneath. His voice dropped lower. You are a pathetic nobody. Interesting choice of words, he continued. You should be grateful we even let you through the door. I glanced at him, then at Blair, then toward the ballroom entrance. Finally, I checked my watch. 8:29 p.m., right on schedule. Garrison followed my gaze. Confusion appeared briefly. Then concern. Then something much worse. I met his eyes, and for the first time that night, I smiled. Not a big smile, just enough. You're out of time, Garrison. The smile disappeared from Garrison's face a fraction of a second before the doors opened. That was the moment I knew. Not because I had received confirmation, because guilty people recognize consequences faster than innocent ones. The ballroom doors swung inward. Hard. Not dramatically, professionally. A dozen federal agents entered in coordinated formation. Dark suits. Visible credentials, focused expressions, no shouting, no confusion, no hesitation. The jazz quartet stopped playing mid-song. Conversations died instantly. Champagne glasses froze halfway to people's mouths. For a moment, the entire ballroom looked like a photograph. Then reality caught up. Several guests stepped backward. Others stared. One reporter nearly dropped his camera. The lead agent moved directly toward the stage, not wandering, not searching. Garrison's color vanished so quickly it was almost impressive. The confident executive from 5 seconds earlier disappeared completely. What remained was the man I had seen outside my father's birthday dinner. The man on the phone. The man trying not to panic. The man who knew exactly why federal agents were walking through the door. Mr. Garrison Pruitt. The lead agent's voice carried across the ballroom. Professional. Controlled. Do not leave your current position. Blair laughed nervously. Actually laughed. The human brain does strange things when reality becomes inconvenient. There must be some mistake. Nobody responded. The lead agent produced paperwork. Several additional agents moved into position. One blocked the hallway, another secured the exits. A third approached the stage. The operation unfolded with the precision of a practice drill. Because it was. Garrison looked around the room, searching, calculating, looking for an escape that didn't exist. His breathing became visibly uneven. Interesting. For a man who claimed to control millions of dollars, he suddenly looked like someone who couldn't control his own hands. "What is this?" Blair demanded. Still, nobody answered her. The agents weren't there to debate. They were there to work. The lead agent began reading from the warrant: financial crimes, fraud, money laundering, conspiracy. The list continued. Each word landed harder than the one before. The audience remained silent, not polite silence. Shock. Raw shock. Near the front table, Winston slowly stood. His face had gone pale. For the first time all evening, certainty abandoned him. Garrison attempted to speak. That was a mistake. 2 agents immediately closed the distance. The message was clear. This situation was no longer negotiable. Then Blair snapped. "Take your hands off my husband!" The scream echoed through the ballroom. She rushed forward. An agent blocked her path. "Ma'am, step back. You can't do this. We already are." That answer didn't help. Blair pointed wildly around the room. "My husband is a respected businessman," no one answered, because respect and evidence are 2 different things. And tonight, evidence had arrived. Garrison's shoulders slumped slightly. Just slightly. The first visible sign of surrender. He knew. The game was over. Then the crowd shifted. Not because of the arrest, because someone new had entered the room. The movement was subtle at first. People stepping aside, conversation stopping, attention redirecting. The effect spread outward through the ballroom like a wave. I already knew who it was. Director Corbin Locke walked through the crowd. Dark suit, silver hair, calm expression. No wasted movement. No need to announce himself. Authority has a way of introducing itself. The room seemed to recognize it instinctively. Several agents straightened as he passed. Others acknowledged him with brief nods. Blair noticed immediately. Desperation creates curiosity. She pointed toward him. "You." Locke didn't react. "Who are you?" "Nothing." She tried again. "Answer me." Still nothing. Because Blair was asking the wrong question. Locke wasn't interested in her, never had been. He walked directly across the ballroom, past the stage, past the reporters, past the guests, past Winston, straight toward me. Every person in the room watched. I remained exactly where I was. The distance between us disappeared. 10 feet. 5 feet. 3. Then Director Corbin Locke stopped directly in front of me. The ballroom became perfectly silent. No music, no conversation. Nothing. For a brief moment, even the agents seemed still. Then Locke stood straighter and delivered a crisp, formal salute. The sound of his hand striking position felt louder than it should have. "Target secured, Commander Winslow." Nobody breathed. "Your intel was flawless." Silence. Absolute silence. The words hung in the air. Commander Winslow. Not Cassidy the failure. Not Cassidy the quitter. Not Cassidy the family disappointment. Commander Winslow. For the first time in 15 years, reality entered the room, and reality was not interested in anyone's opinions. Blair stared at me, completely frozen. The microphone slipped from her hand. It hit the floor with a sharp crack. She took one step backward, then another. "No." The word came out weak, almost childlike. No. Her entire understanding of the world was collapsing in real time. The sister she mocked. The sister she pitied. The sister she used as a comparison point whenever she wanted to feel superior. That sister had just coordinated the operation destroying her husband's empire, without raising her voice, without defending herself, without asking for credit. Near the front table, my father looked even worse. His hand trembled visibly. The wine glass slipped from his fingers. It shattered across the marble floor. Nobody looked at the broken glass. Everyone was looking at me. The realization hit him all at once. The birthday dinner, the warnings, the documents, the transfer meeting, the private conversation in his study. Every moment he had dismissed, every warning he had ignored, every assumption he had made. One by one, like dominoes, his expression changed from confusion to understanding, then understanding to horror, because the truth was finally impossible to avoid. The daughters he spent years treating like a joke had just prevented him from handing his entire legacy to a criminal enterprise. The daughter he called a quitter had quietly saved everything he owned. The daughter he never bothered to understand had been the only person in the family telling the truth. Around us, agents escorted Garrison away. The reporters finally remembered how cameras worked. Flash bulbs exploded throughout the ballroom. Questions started flying. Nobody answered them, not yet, because this wasn't the end. It was simply the moment when 15 years of silence finally became louder than every insult ever thrown at me. The flashes from the cameras gradually slowed. The questions from reporters became distant noise. The excitement that had filled the ballroom an hour earlier had been replaced by something much heavier. Reality. Garrison stood between two federal agents, with his hands secured behind his back. The expensive suit was still there. The polished shoes were still there. The confident smile wasn't, that had disappeared completely. As the agents escorted him toward the exit, he turned once, not toward Blair, not toward my father, toward me. For a brief second, our eyes met. He looked like a man trying to calculate a problem he could no longer solve. Then he was gone. The ballroom doors closed behind him, and just like that, the illusion ended. It was amazing how quickly a perfect life could collapse when it depended on lies. Blair remained frozen near the stage. Mascara streaked the corners of her eyes. Her carefully practiced confidence had vanished. She kept looking toward the doors as if Garrison might suddenly walk back in and explain everything. He wasn't coming back. Not tonight. Possibly not for a very long time. Around the room, guests quietly collected their belongings. Conversations happened in whispers now. People avoided eye contact. Nobody wanted to become part of the story. The same people who had applauded Garrison 30 minutes earlier were suddenly in a hurry to leave. Human nature can be very efficient when it comes to changing sides. One by one, the tables emptied. The musicians packed away their instruments. Hotel staff began clearing abandoned champagne glasses. The enormous ballroom slowly transformed from a celebration into a cleanup operation. I stood near the stage and watched it happen. Not because I felt victorious. Honestly, victory wasn't the right word. Victories are supposed to feel exciting. This felt different, necessary. A quiet voice interrupted my thoughts. Cassidy. I turned. My father stood a few feet away. For the first time in my life, Winston Winslow looked old, not physically, emotionally. The certainty that had carried him through decades of business success was gone. The confidence, the authority, the pride, all missing. He looked like a man reviewing every decision he had made and realizing some of them couldn't be undone. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he looked down at the shattered remains of the wine glass still scattered across the floor, almost as if he couldn't bear to look directly at me. Finally, he asked the question. How long? His voice cracked. The sound surprised both of us. How long have you been doing this? Not what are you, not how did you do it, not why didn't you tell us. Just how long. I understood why. Because the answer measured the size of his mistake. I looked at him, really looked at him. The father who attended Blair's achievements and ignored my absences. The father who called me unstable. The father who refused to read a single page I handed him. The father who believed a fraud and doubted his own daughter. And strangely enough, I didn't feel anger. That had burned out a long time ago. What remained was something quieter. Sadness. Not for myself, for him. Because realizing you've been wrong about someone for 15 years is a terrible thing, especially when that someone never stopped caring about you. A long time, I said softly. He nodded. The answer hurt. I think that was enough. Behind him, Blair finally moved. She approached slowly, not confident anymore, not superior, not victorious, just lost. I almost didn't recognize her. The woman standing there looked nothing like the person who had mocked me at the birthday dinner. Nothing like the woman who demanded public praise at the gala. For the first time, she looked uncertain, human. Dad didn't know, she said quietly. I looked at her. Neither accusation nor defense existed in her voice, just confusion. Maybe regret, maybe fear. I know, you could have told us. There it was, the question people always ask afterward. As if the truth had been hiding because it was fun. As if silence didn't cost anything. I smiled sadly. You never wanted answers, Blair. She didn't respond. Because she knew it was true. Every time I disappeared. Every time I came home exhausted. Every time I avoided discussing work. They had already chosen an explanation. Failure was easier. Failure made sense. Success would have forced them to reconsider everything. And most people would rather protect their assumptions than challenge them. My father finally looked directly at me. The shame in his eyes was impossible to miss. I'm sorry. The words barely escaped. I believed he meant them. That was the tragic part. He meant them now. After the damage, after the years, after the judgment, after all the missed opportunities to understand. Still, I appreciated hearing them. Not because they fixed anything, because they were honest. And honesty was long overdue. I glanced between my father and sister. Two people who had spent years chasing appearances. Status, recognition, validation. The things that always seem important until life proves otherwise. Then I gave them the only answer that mattered. Long enough to learn that real strength doesn't need to shout, Dad. The ballroom remained silent. And real respect doesn't have to be begged for. Neither of them spoke. There wasn't anything left to say. The lesson wasn't new, the consequences were. A movement near the entrance caught my attention. Director Corbin Locke waited patiently near the doors. No pressure, no interruption. Just a quiet signal that it was time. The operation was over. The paperwork would continue. The investigations would continue. Life would continue. I picked up my coat. My father looked like he wanted to say something else. Maybe 100 things. I spare it out of cruelty, out of mercy. Some conversations need time before they can happen honestly. Tonight wasn't that time. I nodded once, then turned away. No dramatic speech, no celebration. No final victory lap, just a choice. One step, then another. Locke fell into stride beside me as we crossed the ballroom together. Behind us sat the remains of pride, assumptions, and arrogance. Ahead of us waited ordinary life. The doors opened. Cool night air greeted us immediately. The city stretched beyond the hotel entrance. Traffic lights, passing cars, people living their lives without any idea what had happened inside that ballroom. Exactly the way I preferred it. No applause waited outside, no recognition, no headlines with my name. Tomorrow, most of the world would continue without ever knowing who I was. That was fine. The work had never been about being seen. And for the first time in a very long while, I realized I no longer needed my family to see me either. I already knew who I was, and that was enough. The next morning, I woke up to 23 missed calls. Most of them came from relatives who hadn't spoken to me in years. Funny how that works. For 15 years, I was the daughter who couldn't finish basic training. For 15 years, I was the quiet one at the end of the table. For 15 years, I was the family disappointment. Then one federal raid happened. Suddenly, everybody became curious. I didn't answer most of the calls. Not because I was angry. Honestly, I was tired. Tired in the way that comes from watching people completely rewrite their opinions overnight. The truth is, nothing about me had changed. I was the same person I had been the week before. The same person I had been at my father's birthday dinner. The same person Blair mocked. The same person's Winston dismissed. The only difference was that people finally had information they considered impressive. And that's what I want to talk about. Because I think this is one of the most dangerous habits people have. We judge each other based on packaging. We do it constantly. We look at someone's car, we look at their house, we look at their clothes, we look at their job title. Then we create an entire story about who they are. Sometimes we do it in less than 30 seconds. I've seen people assume a man was unsuccessful because he drove an old pickup truck, then discover he owned half the commercial properties in the county. I've seen people dismiss a woman because she dressed simply, then learn she ran a company employing hundreds of people. I've seen people treat someone like they were invisible simply because they weren't interested in showing off. That one happens more often than people realize. The problem is that most valuable things in life don't advertise themselves. Competence doesn't always speak loudly. Character doesn't always announce itself. Wisdom rarely walks into a room demanding attention. The people who spend the most energy trying to look powerful are often the people most afraid of being exposed. I learned that lesson many times during my career. Some of the smartest people I've ever worked with looked completely ordinary. You wouldn't notice them at an airport. You wouldn't notice them at a restaurant. You probably wouldn't remember them after a conversation. And that's exactly how they preferred it. Meanwhile, some of the most dangerous people I've encountered spent enormous amounts of effort building an image. Expensive watches, luxury cars, perfect public reputations. The image became so important that protecting it eventually mattered more than telling the truth. Garrison was a perfect example. Everyone in my family looked at his success. Very few people looked at his behavior. Those are not the same thing. Success can be manufactured. Behavior is much harder to fake. Looking back, the warning signs were there. The need for constant admiration, the exaggerated confidence, the obsession with appearances, the unwillingness to answer simple questions directly. But nobody noticed because the packaging looked expensive. People tend to trust confidence even when confidence hasn't earned it. That's a mistake, a very expensive mistake sometimes. My father made that mistake. For years, he measured value through visible achievements. Who earned more? Who owned more? Who impressed more people? The problem with that system is that it eventually stops measuring character. It starts measuring performance. And performance can be faked. Character can't. One of the hardest truths I learned is that silence makes people uncomfortable. When people don't understand you, they create explanations. If you don't tell them your story, they'll invent one. Sometimes those stories are unfair. Sometimes they're ridiculous. Sometimes they become permanent. That happened to me. I couldn't explain where I worked. I couldn't explain why I disappeared. I couldn't explain why I occasionally looked exhausted after returning home. So people filled the empty space with assumptions. Cassidy failed. Cassidy quit. Cassidy couldn't figure life out. The story made sense to them. Unfortunately, making sense and being true are not the same thing. If there's one lesson I hope people take from my story, it's this. Be careful when judging someone's life from the outside. You don't know what battles they're fighting. You don't know what responsibilities they're carrying. You don't know what sacrifices they've made. And you definitely don't know the whole story. The person driving the oldest car in the parking lot might be the most financially responsible person there. The quiet person in the meeting might be the smartest one in the room. The family member everyone underestimates might be the one protecting everybody else. Life has a way of surprising us when we become too certain about our assumptions. My father eventually realized that. Unfortunately, he learned it the hard way. The most painful loss Winston suffered wasn't financial. He didn't lose the estate. He didn't lose the family assets. He didn't lose his business. What he lost was much harder to replace. He lost 15 years he could have spent knowing his daughter, 15 years of conversations that never happened, 15 years of trust that never had a chance to grow, 15 years spent believing a story that wasn't true. And the sad part is that no federal investigation can recover that. No court can restore it. No amount of money can buy it back. That's why I think the greatest lesson from everything that happened isn't about fraud or betrayal. It's about perception. Before you decide who someone is, take the time to understand who they actually are. Because the person you're tempted to underestimate today may be carrying a weight you can't even imagine. And sometimes, the strongest person in the room is the one nobody bothers to notice. One question kept showing up in the messages I received after everything happened. People wanted to know how Garrison could have been so careless. Some asked how Blair missed all the warning signs. Others wanted to know how my father could ignore so much evidence sitting directly in front of him. Those are fair questions. But I think they missed the real. The biggest problem wasn't that any of them lacked intelligence. The biggest problem was that they stopped questioning themselves. And that is far more dangerous than failure. Failure gets a bad reputation. Most people spend their lives trying to avoid it. They hide from it, fear it, feel embarrassed by it. But failure usually teaches something. Pride rarely does. Failure forces you to examine yourself. Pride convinces you there's nothing to examine. That's why I don't think Garrison's downfall started with financial fraud. I think it started much earlier. It started when he became convinced he was smarter than everyone else in the room. Once that happens, people stop listening. They stop learning. They stop asking difficult questions. And eventually they start believing their own sales pitch. I've seen it happen many times, not just in criminal investigations, in businesses, in families, in relationships, in government, everywhere. Someone experiences success, then success turns into certainty. Then certainty turns into arrogance. Then arrogance starts making decisions. The ending is usually predictable. One of the most valuable habits I've learned is simple. Whenever I become absolutely certain about something, I force myself to look for evidence that I'm wrong. Not because I enjoy being wrong. Nobody does. Because certainty is dangerous. A person willing to challenge their own assumptions becomes harder to deceive. A person who refuses to challenge them becomes easy to manipulate. My father was manipulated because Garrison told him exactly what he wanted to hear. That wasn't an accident. Good manipulators study desire. They identify what people desperately want to believe. Then they package that belief and sell it back to them. My father wanted to believe he had found the perfect successor for the Winslow legacy. Garrison gave him that story. Blair wanted to believe she had built the perfect life. Garrison gave her that story too. Neither of them asked enough questions because they loved the answers. That's another lesson worth remembering. The things we want to believe are often the things we should examine most carefully. The conversation in my father's study taught me something I'll never forget. Not because of what he said, because of what he refused to do. Remember, I wasn't asking him to trust me completely. I wasn't asking him to transfer money. I wasn't asking him to cancel the deal. I asked him to read the documents. That's it, just read them. Take a closer look. Delay the decision. Ask questions. Verify. He wouldn't do it. Not because the evidence was weak. Because accepting the possibility that I was right would have forced him to accept the possibility that he was wrong. And for some people, that feels unbearable. Here's the truth. Nobody becomes less valuable by admitting they made a mistake. In fact, the opposite is usually true. One of the strongest leaders I ever worked with had a habit that surprised everyone. Whenever new information appeared, he would ask the same question. What am I missing? Not how do I prove I'm right? Not who disagrees with me? Not how do I win this argument? Just what am I missing? Simple question. Powerful question. That question prevented mistakes. It prevented blind spots. It prevented pride from taking control. Most importantly, it kept him learning. I think a lot of people watching this story can apply that lesson immediately. Maybe it's a business decision. Maybe it's a relationship. Maybe it's a disagreement with a spouse, friend, child, or coworker. Maybe someone keeps warning you about something. Maybe multiple people are warning you. Before dismissing them, stop. Take a breath. Look again. You don't have to agree. But investigate. Ask questions. Challenge your own conclusion. Because sometimes the most expensive sentence in the world is, I already know. Garrison thought he already knew. Blair thought she already knew. My father thought he already knew. And all three paid a price for that certainty. One lost his freedom. One lost the life she believed she had built. One nearly lost everything he spent decades creating. All because they stopped questioning their assumptions. That's why I believe pride is more dangerous than failure. Failure is temporary. Failure can be corrected. Failure often makes us wiser. Pride convinces us we're already wise enough. And that's when the real trouble begins. If there's one thing I hope you take away from this part of my story, it's this. Never become so attached to being right that you stop looking for the truth. The truth doesn't care about our opinions. It doesn't care about our reputation. It doesn't care how successful we are. Eventually, reality shows up. And when it does, reality always wins. The smartest people I've ever met weren't the people who knew everything. They were the people humble enough to keep learning. That's a lesson I hope never to forget. There is one final lesson I want to leave you with. And honestly, it's probably the most important lesson I learned from everything that happened. For most of my life, I thought I wanted respect from my family. That sounds reasonable, doesn't it? Most of us want that. We want our parents to be proud of us. We want our siblings to appreciate us. We want the people closest to us to see our value. There's nothing wrong with that. The problem begins when we make their approval a requirement for our happiness. I made that mistake for years. Not openly, not consciously, but I made it. Every holiday gathering, every family dinner, every awkward conversation. A small part of me hoped this would be the time they finally understood me. Maybe this year would be different. Maybe this conversation would be different. Maybe my father would finally see me. Maybe Blair would stop competing long enough to simply be my sister. Maybe. That's a dangerous word sometimes. Because if we're not careful, we can spend years building our lives around a maybe. Maybe they'll change. Maybe they'll understand. Maybe they'll apologize. Maybe they'll finally give us the love, support, or respect we've been chasing. And before we know it, we've handed other people control over our peace of mind. One of the strangest moments of my life happened after the gala. Not during the arrest, not during the investigation, not when my father apologized afterward. Much later, I was sitting alone in my townhouse eating takeout from a container balanced on my kitchen counter. Nothing glamorous, nothing dramatic, just a normal Tuesday evening, and I realized something. For the first time in years, I wasn't wondering what my family thought of me. The thought simply wasn't there. That surprised me. Because for so long, their opinion had occupied space in my mind whether I wanted it to or not. Then suddenly it didn't. Not because they finally approved of me. Not because they finally understood me. Because I finally stopped needing them to. That distinction matters. A lot. One of the biggest mistakes people make is believing confidence comes from convincing everyone else of their worth. It doesn't. Real confidence comes from knowing your worth even when other people don't. That's much harder and much healthier. I think about Blair sometimes. Not with anger, not anymore. I think one of the saddest things about her wasn't her arrogance. It was how desperately she needed validation. Everything had to be visible. Every achievement had to be announced. Every success had to be displayed. Every room had to know she was winning. That sounds exhausting. Because if your value depends on other people noticing you, you'll spend your entire life performing. And performances never end. That's why I don't believe attention and respect are the same thing. A lot of people confuse them. Attention is easy to get. Respect is harder. Attention can come from wealth. Respect comes from character. Attention can come from status. Respect comes from consistency. Attention can be purchased. Respect has to be earned. Garrison had attention. Lots of it. The room applauded him. The newspapers praised him. People admired him. Look how quickly all of that disappeared. Because attention built on image is fragile. Character lasts longer. That's why I tell people to focus less on looking successful and more on becoming valuable. There's a difference. One creates an appearance. The other creates a life. If you're constantly trying to prove yourself to people who have already decided not to understand you, let me offer some advice. Stop. Not because those relationships don't matter, because your energy matters too. You cannot force understanding. You cannot force respect. And you certainly cannot force someone to see your value if they're committed to ignoring it. At some point, you have to stop presenting evidence and start living your life. Build your skills, keep your promises, do good work. Treat people well, maintain your integrity. Then let the results speak. The right people will notice, and the wrong people wouldn't have listened anyway. Looking back now, the most satisfying part of my story wasn't watching Garrison get arrested. It wasn't proving Blair wrong. It wasn't even hearing my father apologize. The most satisfying moment happened when I walked out of that hotel. No spotlight, no applause, no victory speech, just a quiet understanding. I knew exactly who I was, and I no longer needed anyone else's permission to feel good about it. That kind of peace is worth more than any inheritance. It's more than status, more than reputation, more than being right. So if you've followed my story all the way to this point, I hope you'll remember this. Know who you are before the world tells you who you should be. Don't let other people's opinions become your identity. Don't let their limitations become your limits. And don't spend your life begging for respect from people who refuse to give it. Real strength doesn't need an audience. Real confidence doesn't need constant approval. And real dignity comes from refusing to abandon yourself, even when everyone around you misunderstands you. Thank you for spending this time with me and following this journey from beginning to end. If this story meant something to you, if it gave you a lesson you can carry into your own life, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Tell me the biggest takeaway you had from this story. And if you enjoy stories about resilience, family dynamics, personal growth, and hard-earned life lessons, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We share new stories every single day at 8:30 a.m. ET and 1:30 p.m. ET. Join us again for the next premiere. Until then, take care of yourself, trust your instincts, and never let anyone else decide your worth.